Was King Arthur's greatest victory at the Battle of Badon fought in South Wales? Outside of the academic world, many believe Mynydd Badon near Llanganwyd to be the site of this famous victory. Some historians of the past have also believed that Mynydd Badon was the site of this victory. The subject of one of my previous videos was Dafydd Morgannwg's description of Mynydd Badon near Llanganwyd as the battle site of the Battle of Badon. He wrote in the 1870s, and this is the earliest source that I'm aware of that does record a tradition placing the battle site on Mynydd Badon. More recently, this theory was advocated in the popular book The Holy Kingdom, which is authored by Adrian Gilbert and co-authored by Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett. Now, these authors present lots of different pieces of evidence to support their claim, but one piece of evidence that drew my attention was their interpretation of a mysterious Welsh prose tale called Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. It's a tale that is recorded in only one Welsh medieval manuscript, Llyfr Coch Hergest, the Red Book of Hergest. The tale mentions King Arthur and references traditions associated with him, including the battles of Badon and Camlan. And the location of Badon is described in relation to many other place names. Now, Gilbert, Wilson and Blackett essentially suggest that Badon in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy is clearly described as being in the vicinity of Mynydd Badon near Llanganwyd. Now, most scholars don't interpret Breuddwyd Rhonabwy in the same way that Gilbert, Wilson and Blackett have done. So what I want to do in this video is to take a close eye on the text and to see whether or not Breuddwyd Rhonabwy can support any theories that locate the Battle of Badon to a modern day location. Now, before I take a close eye on the text, I'll just give you a quick background on the Battle of Badon. The Battle of Badon is widely accepted as a real historical event that happened either late in the 5th century or early in the 6th century. It's one of the few historical events that we can be pretty sure of at this period of time. It was fought somewhere in Britain at a time of great Saxon expansion and migration. Badon was a great victory for the Britons against the Saxons, and it stopped their expansion for a considerable period of time. We do have a near contemporary source that does mention this battle. In the 6th century, the cleric Gildas mentions the siege of Mons Badonicus, which he describes as a great victory for the Britons over the Saxons. But Gildas doesn't tell us who led the Britons, and he doesn't give us any obvious clues as to where it was fought. In the 8th century, Bede mentions the battle, but no clues as to the location. The next surviving source that mentions the battle is the Historia Brittonum. This source probably dates to the early 9th century, and it does tell us a little bit more about the Battle of Badon. Badon is first attributed to the war leader known as Arthur, and listed among 12 great victories for him. But there's still no real clues as to where the Battle of Badon was fought. Today, there's no consensus among scholars as to where Badon was, although many believe it to have been fought within the modern territory of England. But the name Badon doesn't obviously match any place names that we know about in England today. One issue is that most of the place names in England have changed since the time of the battle. In the post-Roman period, the territory of England would have been the territory of the Britons, and place names would have been, in their language, Brythonic. With the Saxon expansion, the old Brythonic names would have been gradually replaced with Anglo-Saxon names. There are, of course, plenty of remnants in England of Brythonic place names. It is highly likely that what was known as Badon at the time of Gildas is now known as something else, with no real record of where Badon was located. Having said that, there is one place name in modern day England that does seem to be a close match with the word Badon. The Welsh name for Bath is Carfadon. That means the fort of Badon. This is the same word as what's used in Welsh for the location of the Battle of Badon. And one very famous historian, Geoffrey of Monmouth, does place the Battle of Badon in Carfadon, specifically on Salisbury Hill. The problem with placing the Battle of Badon in Bath is that the modern Welsh name for the town, Carfadon, is thought to derive from a later Anglo-Saxon name that postdates the Battle of Badon. Therefore, the link between Bath and the Battle of Badon is generally dismissed. So, the scarcity of place name records and the lack of clarity in the earliest historical records over the location means it's really difficult to place the site of the Battle of Badon. Now, unlike in England, in Wales, our place names are predominantly in the Welsh language, which is a descendant of the Brythonic that was spoken by the Britons at the time of Arthur. The place name records in Wales don't generally tend to go back to this period of time, and we shouldn't just assume that because place names are in Welsh that they are necessarily this old as well. So superficially at least, the place name Badon near Llanganwyd is similar to Badon where Arthur fought and beat the Saxons. But how long has the location near Llanganwyd had this name? Could it at least date back to the time of Arthur? Place name records for Badon near Llanganwyd go back to the 12th century, and the name is recorded as Badon then. Although the two Badons do sound kind of similar, one problem that we have is that they are always spelled subtly differently. Now, obviously, there wasn't a standard spelling for places until relatively recently. There are variants over time, but there isn't that exact match with the spelling which would link the two places more closely. Okay, so as I've said, the text of Breuddwyd mentions the location of the Battle of Badon. So let's have a closer eye on that text, starting with a quick background. As I previously mentioned, Breuddwyd is preserved in only one Welsh medieval manuscript, Llyfr Coch Hergest, the Red Book of Hergest. The manuscript is a compilation of quite a diverse range of literature. There is both poetry and prose. Now, of the prose content of this manuscript, there are brutes, there are histories, and there are chronicles. And then there are stories. 11 of the stories from Llyfr Coch Hergest have later been grouped together and called the Mabinogion, which is a name that is still around today. But this name wasn't probably used at the time of Llyfr Coch Hergest. Breuddwyd is one of these Mabinogion. Now, this grouping of stories was probably never meant to really happen. They are quite diverse. Of the 11 stories, there are 4 stories which do seem to relate to each other, and they are known as the Mabinogi. But Breuddwyd is not one of the Mabinogi. Yes, I admit that the terminology has become quite confusing over time. What I think is important to remember is that Breuddwyd is a prose tale that doesn't really seem to relate to any of the other tales in Llyfr Coch Hergest. One observation made by scholars who've studied Breuddwyd is that this tale seems to be more deliberately authored than some of the others. Breuddwyd seems to have one author that wrote a story which refers to historical traditions, whereas the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, for instance, are usually seen as originating from simple stories over a period of centuries or maybe even longer and elaborated on gradually over time, firstly from an oral tradition before being written down. So the Mabinogi would have had simple origins and then became gradually more complex over time. So when was Breuddwyd written down? The text of Llyfr Coch Hergest was compiled at around the year 1400, probably for someone called Hopkyn ap Thomas of Ynysfordd gan Swansea. So that's really interesting because the manuscript seems to originate from the same general area as where Wilson, Blackett and Gilbert say the Battle of Badon was fought, and where they trace the origins of King Arthur. You probably know who the scribe was. Hywel Vychan fab Hywel Goch o Viecht, Viecht referring to Builth Wells. So the latest that the story could have been written down was the year 1400. The earliest that the story could be dated to is the mid-12th century because it does refer to characters from that period of time, so it couldn't have been any earlier than that. We're looking at sometime between the year 1160 and 1400. The usual suggestion is that Breuddwyd was written sometime during the 13th century and then later copied into Llyfr Coch Hergest. So the story of Breuddwyd, which means the dream of Rhonabwy, is very interesting. I'm now going to summarise some of the key points of the narrative. The story begins with someone called Rhonabwy, who is previously unattested in Welsh literature. Rhonabwy and his companions set off to find the historical figure of Iorwerth ap Meredydd. They did this on behalf of Iorwerth's brother Madog. Madog ruled over Powys from 1130 to 1160, and I've shaded in his approximate territory on this map. Rhonabwy and his companions lodge for the night in the house of someone called Heilyn Goch. Rhonabwy goes to lie down on a yellow heifer skin and is granted a drych. This translates to a dream or a vision, and this is the dream of the title, Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. In the dream, Rhonabwy is transported from the 12th century into the Arthurian world. In the dream, Rhonabwy meets King Arthur, and there are references to Badon and Camlan, which are the two most famous Arthurian battles. Now, Badon is mentioned as being in the vicinity of the places Argingroig, Digoch, Havren, and Rhydygrais. A place named Cernyw also comes up later in the tale. Throughout the dream sequence of the tale, Rhonabwy is guided by someone called Iddog or Iddawg. Iddog leads Rhonabwy to where Arthur is encamped, ready to fight the Battle of Badon. But Arthur doesn't go to battle. Instead, he becomes engrossed in a game of Breuddwyd with Owain ab Urien. Arthur continues to play Breuddwyd even when his men begin fighting with Owain's ravens. Osla Gallellfawr is identified as the leader of Arthur's enemy, the Saxons, at the Battle of Badon, but the Battle of Badon doesn't take place in this tale. Instead, a truce is called. After this, Arthur's followers are told to gather with him in Cernyw. With this, the dream ends. No part of the tale is set in Cernyw or on the journey there, and Rhonabwy wakes up having slept for 3 days and nights. So to summarise again, this character of Rhonabwy has a dream or a drych where he's transported to the Arthurian world. He meets King Arthur and some others before the Battle of Badon, but the battle doesn't take place and a truce is called. So where does the Arthurian section of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy take place? Other than Gilbert, Wilson and Blackett, I've only heard suggestions of Powys. Gwallter Mechain suggested a location near Aberystwyth, and Lady Charlotte Guest, who published an influential edition of the Mabinogion, followed him. But later, the historian J. E. Lloyd suggested a location near Buttington, and most scholars today follow this. Okay, I think that the thing to do now to be really sure is to refer to the text of the story itself. I'm going to read out the Welsh from the transcript of the text by the scholar Melville Richards, which is the standard version of this text. I'll also read out a translation by the scholar Sioned Davies, and I've checked it against the manuscript as well, so I'll put up a screenshot of the manuscript too. So in this first extract I'm going to read, Rhonabwy and his companions have first entered the dream, and they are described as travelling across somewhere called Maes Argingroig towards somewhere called Rhydygrais ar Havren. Rhydygrais ar Havren translates as Ford of the Cross on the Havren. Fod ef a'i gydymdeithion yn cerdded ar draws Maes Argingroig a'i ohen a'i fryd a debygau yw fod parth a Rhydygrais ar Havren. He and his companions were travelling across Maes Argingroig, and his inclination and intent, so he thought, was towards Rhydygrais on the Havren. So the story then moves on, and in this next extract, Rhonabwy and his companions are described when they first meet Arthur. Arthur is described as sitting on an ynys below the ford. The ford is elsewhere described as Rhydygrais ar Havren. Sioned Davies has translated ynys as meadow, but it could also mean island, and this is pointed out in Sioned Davies' notes and also in Melville Richards' notes. So the exact text reads, ac y lan yr ryd y ddeithant, sef y gwelynd Arthur, yn eistedd mewn ynys wastad is y rhyd. They came to the edge of the ford, and saw Arthur sitting on a flat meadow below the ford. This next extract is a bit longer, but it does cover several relevant points. The Battle of Badon is mentioned as being planned for noon, and Arthur's adversary is identified as Osla Gallellfawr. Osla also appears in Culhwch ac Olwen, but he has a different role. He's part of Arthur's court in Culhwch. The characters are then described as moving towards Cefn Digoch, or the Ridge of Digoch. They cross a river, and halfway across they look up the Havren Valley. So to me, it's clear that the body of water being forded is a river known as Havren. Here's the text. Ac yna dwawd gŵr bach teledu ac ymadrodd banga we hawn ganddo, bod yn rhyfedd gyseingio'r llu cymaint o hwn, yn lle cyfynged o hwn. Ac a oedd rhyfeddach ganddo bod yma yr awr hon a oedd ewa i bod yn gwaith faddon erbyn hanner dydd yn ymladd ag Osla Gallellfawr. A dewis di a'i cerdded a'i na cherdych, my fi y gerddaf, gwir y dywedi heb yr Arthur, a cherddon yna ynghyd, ac a ddyna i'r awg ag y merth Rhonabwy I Sigil, ac y cychwyn ysont y llu mawr hwnnw, bod byddin yn y chywair parth a chefn digoll, ac wedi ei dyfod hyd yn perdded y rhyd a'r hafren troi a oric Rhonabwy ar ddyffryn hafren, sef gweladwy fyddin waraf yn dyfod tu'r rhyd a'r hafren. The translation is, then a proud, handsome man with eloquent, bold speech said that it was strange that a host as large as that could be accommodated in such a confined place, and that it was even stranger that those who had promised to be at the Battle of Badon by noon to fight Osla Gallechfawr should still be there. Decide whether you will go or not. I shall go. You are right, said Arthur, and let us go together. Then Iddog took Rhonabwy behind him on a horse, and that large host set off towards Cefn Digoll, each troop in its proper place. When they were halfway across the ford, Iddog turned his horse's head around, and Rhonabwy looked at the Hafren valley. He could see two most disciplined troops approaching the ford on the Hafren. Arthur is then described as dismounting below Carfadon, so the assumption is that Carfadon is in the same general area as Cefn Digoll and the other places mentioned. Here's the text. A fan o'r ddiweddas Antilli, neu disgyn as ei Arthur a'i Lia Cedyrn oedd East Carfadon. By the time these had caught up with the host, Arthur and his host of warriors had dismounted below Carfadon. It is at this point that Arthur offers Owain Abirian a game of Breuddwyd, and a truce is called with Osla Gallechfawr for a fortnight and a month, so the Battle of Badon, in this tale at least, doesn't take place. The last bit that I'll be quoting is right at the end of the dream sequence, and the character Kai gets up and says, the followers of Arthur should join him that evening in Cernyw. So Cernyw, in the logic of this dream at least, must be within a few hours' travel of Badon and the other places mentioned in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. Remember that the Battle of Badon had previously been described as being planned for noon that day. Yna hycoddus Cai ac y dwawd pwy bynnag a fyno canlyn Arthur bydd heno y Gernyw gydag ef. Then Cai got up and said, whoever wishes to follow Arthur, let him be with him tonight in Cernyw. So, from the text, I think that we can infer the following. In the dream, Rhonabwy and his companions start in a place called Argingroig. Nearby is the River Hafren, and there is a ford on the River Hafren called Rhyd y Groes. There is a flat river meadow, or an island, in this location where they see Arthur. They move towards Cefn Digoll, and as they halfway ford the Hafren, they look up the Hafren valley. They then dismount below Carfadon, and it's mentioned that the followers of Arthur should join him that evening in Cernyw. The dream then ends, so no part of the tale is actually set in Cernyw or the journey there. The events of the dream in the real world lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I said earlier that more scholars these days place these events near Buttington. So let's have a look on Google Earth to see these toponyms in the location. The first place mentioned in the dream, Argingroig, is well attested. Today, it still appears on maps as Gingrog, so it has changed a little bit. There's an early 14th century record of Argingroig, and it appears as a place where a market was held. Rhyd y Groes is thought to be in an area now known as Buttington Cross, on the River Severn in the vicinity of the village of Buttington. There was a famous battle here in 1039 in which Griffith ap Llywelyn defeated the Saxons. There's a clear view of the Severn Valley, and there is also a small island visible in the river. As I mentioned earlier, and this could be an island or also a river meadow. The toponym Digoll is found associated with an earthwork on Long Mountain. The 7th century ruler Cadwallon fought a battle of Digoll. This is mentioned by a poem of uncertain date, which is also in the Llyfr Coch Hergest, and mentioned in a 12th century poem by Cynddelw Breuddwyd. In Humphrey Llwyd's Chronic of Walia of 1559, Digoll is associated with the revolt of Madog ap Llywelyn of 1295. One Arthurian author and expert on place names is Scott Lloyd, and he has said the following. The Arthurian section of the tale is set on the evidence of 3 place names that are mentioned in a small area near Welshpool. The author of the Dream of Rhonabwy also places Gwaith Faddon in the same area, a localization not found in any other Welsh source. This confined area, north of Welshpool, does not play any further role in Welsh Arthurian sources, and the reasons for locating the narrative in this area remain uncertain. Having looked at the map, I must say that the places mentioned near Wellspool do seem to correspond well with the text of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. But as I mentioned at the start, there is another theory. So let's have a close look at this alternative suggestion, which is favoured by authors Alan Wilson, Baron Blackett, and Adrian Gilbert. For these authors, the events in the dream section of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy take place in Glamorgan, that is, southeast Wales. In the Holy Kingdom, Adrian Gilbert writes, in the Mabinogi stories, King Arthur is said to have fought the Battle of Badon just a few miles from the River Severn. Now, Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, as I said earlier, is not technically one of the Mabinogi. The term Mabinogi proper refers to the 4 branches, but the nomenclature has become quite complicated, with 11 stories referred to as the Mabinogion. But to be clear, the 4 branches of the Mabinogi don't refer to the Battle of Badon at all. What Adrian Gilbert must be referring to here is the reference to Badon in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. But it's a very vague and ambiguous reference by Adrian Gilbert. But Wilson and Blackett were much clearer on this in their earlier career when they wrote their self-published books. In Artorius Rex Discovered, they say the following. The ancient Mabinogion tale of the dream of Rhonabwy tells us of how the hero Rhonabwy sleeps at an ancient oxide. This we then identify as the yellow fort of Carmelin. In the morning, Rhonabwy and his companions travel across a wide plain, and this would be the Cardiff plain where the city now stands. They then meet Iddawg the Trwyn, who takes them across an ancient road, and this would be the Roman road across the Vale of Glamorgan. They then go on. Finally, they arrive at an island on the banks of the Severn, and this can only be the island and defended areas at the banks of the Severn where the Ogmore and Owenny rivers join the mighty Severn estuary. Here King Arthur is gathering his armies at early morning to go off to fight the Battle of Badon at noon. An odd incident is recorded when a youth fails to recognise the king and splashes him when he excitedly rides his horse into the river. This could easily happen at the ford alongside Ogmore Castle even today. King Arthur instructs his followers to gather at Cernyw that night. This Cernyw cannot be Cornwall, which is almost 300 miles away by land route and well over 100 by sea. Instead, it is Cernyw just west of Cardiff, some 20 miles west of Mynydd Badon. It is in this area of Cernyw, still marked on the maps, that Carmelin or Camelot is situated. Okay, so Wilson and Blackett are really clear about what they think. So what I'm going to do now is get Google Earth back up just to see how well what they've said matches up with the map. So for Wilson and Blackett, the journey within the dream starts in the Cardiff area. Breuddwyd Rhonabwy calls this Maes Argyngroeg, but I'm not aware of a historically attested toponym of that name in the Cardiff area. We then move west towards Ogmore Castle. The river, called Havren in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, Wilson and Blackett believe is Môr Havren. This body of water is technically an inlet of the North Atlantic Ocean, although the River Severn does flow into it further east. If you cast your mind back to Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, the characters ford a body of water known as Havren. It's not possible at all to ford Môr Havren. It's too deep and too long. The name Môr Havren is interesting, and I'm sure that listeners will be familiar with the Mabinogi tales, where this same body of water is referred to as Aberhenfelen. Môr Havren is an authentically old name for this body of water and is attested in the Book of Llandaff as such. Now, based on Wilson and Blackett's suggestion, the body of water that is forded by the characters is actually known as the River Owenny. It flows next to Ogmore Castle there. Now, the Owenny is close to Môr Havren here, and it does flow into it nearby, but it's still very obviously a separate body of water at this point. So for me, it doesn't quite meet the description of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. The toponym Digoch is also mentioned in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. That toponym I haven't found attested anywhere near Ogmore Castle. We can see Mynydd Badon in the background, and that's the location favoured by Gilbert, Wilson and Blackett for the historical Battle of Badon. But now, having looked at the map, I must say that these locations don't seem to quite match up with what is described in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. And essentially, they're not as close a match as the locations proposed by others near Buttington. So to summarise the points against saying that Breuddwyd Rhonabwy is set near Ogmore Castle, I would say the following. The body of water being forded is not the Havren. There is no view of the Havren Valley anywhere, whereas in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, the characters are explicitly described as looking at the Havren Valley. There's no evidence for toponyms Argingroig or Digoch in this area. To me, this just doesn't seem to be the setting of the Arthurian section of Breuddwyd. Now, I know that some are going to be disappointed that I've come to the conclusion that I have. Essentially, the Breuddwyd probably doesn't place the Battle of Badon near Llangynig, it instead places it in Buttington near Welshpool. Now, because Badon is near Buttington in Breuddwyd, is that to say the real Battle of Badon was necessarily in that same location? There's lots of reasons to doubt this. As I mentioned earlier, Breuddwyd seems to have been authored many centuries after the historical Battle of Badon. We have to ask whether the author, probably writing in the 13th century, would really have known where the battle was fought anyway. Assuming that the author is actually trying to tell us where the real battle was fought, there's still so much time between the events and the time it was authored that a lot of unhistorical myth and legend could have set in. But on the other hand, I'm sure that the people in the late medieval period were still aware of genuine traditions associated with Arthur that haven't passed down to us to this day. And this is something that we just can't really know, unfortunately. So we really have to question whether or not Breuddwyd can include any genuine historical details relating to the location of the real Battle of Badon. Now, scholars say that Breuddwyd doesn't refer to the real location of Badon, although there's no scholarly consensus as to the location of the real battle site. We know that it was fought somewhere in Britain, but there's not many clues otherwise, so we can't fully rule out Buttington, or anywhere else in that case. Historians don't use Breuddwyd for a historical source in the same way that Wilson and Blackett have done, and I think that we have to be really careful about this. All the references to Arthur and Badon take place within a literary dream. So can we take the references to places at face value? Now, we've all had dreams, and in dreams, things happen a lot differently to how they do in real life. In dreams, events, people, and places are distorted, and I think that this is how it is in Breuddwyd. For instance, in the dream episode, time seems to be running backwards. Early in the dream, Iddog tells Rhonabwy that the Battle of Camlan had been fought over 7 years ago, and yet the Battle of Badon hadn't even been fought yet. Whereas traditionally, Badon is before Camlan, Camlan being Arthur's final battle. The Annals Cambriae suggest dates of 516 for Badon and 537 for Camlan, although Wilson and Blackett have suggested dates of 33 years later for both events, and other historians have dated the battles differently too, although Badon is always dated before Camlan. Another dreamlike aspect of the tale is the fact that Arthur isn't as we would expect. In the late medieval romantic cycle, Arthur is portrayed as a paragon of chivalry, very heroic, although in some of the lives of the Welsh saints he's also portrayed in quite an unheroic way. Now, my suggestion, for what it's worth, is that the location of Badon in Breuddwyd is placed where it is as part of a dreamlike inversion of real events. So just like how time is not running as you'd expect it to run, and people aren't acting like you'd expect them to act, the Battle of Badon is also not located in its proper place. And I doubt that they even would have known at that time where the real battle had taken place. The question that we have to ask now is, what do the events in Breuddwyd mean, and what was the intention of the author? The answer is that we don't really know. We're also so far removed from this period of time that a lot of the references are just lost on us and we can't really understand it. There were several other dreams in medieval European literature, but Breuddwyd is somewhat different to these. There's no obvious moral lesson and no prophecy. The story draws on Welsh Arthurian traditions, less so the romantic Arthurian tradition that was popular across Europe. One idea that comes up quite a lot in the scholarly literature is that the purpose of Breuddwyd was to be a sort of satire or a parody of the cliched Arthurian literature of that time. And as far as I can see, this is the best explanation as to its meaning. When you look at Arthur in Breuddwyd, he's more of a mockery of a medieval king. Arthur doesn't do any heroic acts. He actually doesn't do much at all apart from play Breuddwyd. The narrative is so meaningless and dreamlike that you have to ask, Was this even a real dream that someone had and decided to write it down, without any other wider meaning at all? We can't really know this, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. Now, I don't think that the author of this story intended to transmit to us in the 21st century genuine historical details. Please be very careful if you're trying to interpret it in that way. Obviously, it could include genuine history, but we just can't really know. And there's a lot of reasons to think why it might not. Now, having looked at Breuddwyd Rhonabwy in the way that we've done, I don't think that on balance it can be used as evidence to place Badon in a particular location. Now, this was just one piece of evidence that Wilson, Blackett and Gilbert have used. I'm not going to look at all the other evidence in this video, or I might do it in another video, who knows. But I'm not completely writing this theory off. I'm just saying that Breuddwyd Rhonabwy probably doesn't allude to a location near Llanganwyd, or this doesn't really have any bearing on the real history. The literary purpose of the author of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy was to take facts and invert them. I think that's what's happened here. If the author was aware of the real location of Badon, he's changed it in his story for somewhere else. So the site near Llanganwyd is still a possible contender, although I don't think that we really know. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there on Badon for now. But can the tale tell us anything else about history relating to King Arthur? A couple of other suggestions come up in Adrian Gilbert and Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett's work. One thing that caught my eye is the identification of Osla Gellellvawr as the real leader of the Saxons, Arthur's enemy at Badon. Could this be real history? If you remember from the story, Osla was the leader of the Saxons, and a truce was called with him for a fortnight and a month, and the Battle of Badon didn't take place. So what do we know of Osla outside of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy? Apart from a couple of dubious mentions in genealogies, the only mention of Osla is in Culhwch ac Olwen, so once again Welsh literature rather than history. Interestingly, Osla was part of Arthur's court and played a prominent role in hunting a Twrch Trwyth. But we hardly get any details on Osla from both Culhwch ac Olwen and Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. It's usually understood that Osla is a Saxon. His epithet Gellellvawr, or Big Knife, is thought to be an allusion to the treachery of the Long Knives, which was supposedly a historical event where the Saxons slaughtered 300 British nobles at the peace conference. Now, if you were to take both Culhwch ac Olwen and Breuddwyd Rhonabwy as history, I'm not suggesting that we should, but if you were to do that, then you would have to conclude that at different times, Osla and Arthur were both allies and enemies. Of course, there are instances of people being allies and enemies at different times. But this does sort of conflict a little bit with the traditional view of the relationship between the Saxons and the Britons at the time, which is mainly inspired by Gildas's suggestion the Britons and the Saxons were more or less in a complete war against each other. So from a traditional point of view, the fact that Osla as a Saxon was Arthur's enemy at Badon is sort of more historical than Culhwch ac Olwen, where he is allied with Arthur. But the nature of the relationship between the Saxons and the Britons is more debated today. Were they completely hostile to each other, as was traditionally understood? Or could they be more cooperative towards each other and act in a more pragmatic way? Lots of historians see it like this today. The ultimate supremacy of the Saxons over the Britons throughout England could be seen as the result of more benign acculturation. It's something that's hotly debated, and it was written about recently in an article for The Collector by Caleb Howells. I'd recommend reading further there. So it's not impossible that Osla was the leader of the Saxons of Badon. Once again, there could have been a lot of traditions and knowledge of Osla that hasn't been transmitted to us today, but was known by the author of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. I have seen some suggestions that try to equate Osla with other historical figures, but there's nothing that I'm completely convinced about, to be honest. So I think that from the little information that we have, we can just say that Osla was possibly the historical leader of the Saxons of Badon. Or otherwise, his role as a leader of the Saxons is just another dreamlike inversion from his role in Culhwch ac Olwen. Now I'm going to end with what I think is the most interesting suggestion that Wilson and Blackett have made from their analysis of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy. That is the location of Cernyw. To us modern Welsh speakers, Cernyw is synonymous with the English county of Cornwall. That is the name that we use for that county on the very southwesterly tip of Britain. Now, from the records that have survived to this day, it seems that that name, Cernyw, has been applied to the county of Cornwall since at least the 9th century, possibly longer. In Sioned Davies's edition of Breuddwyd Rhonabwy, you would have noticed that she had translated Cernyw as Cornwall, and there's wide agreement amongst scholars that this is the case. The author was referring to Cornwall. But could this have been misunderstood? Could Breuddwyd Rhonabwy actually be referring to somewhere else? Cernyw is well recorded in Welsh literature in relation to Arthur. Welsh triads seem to record some of the earliest traditions of Arthur. Arthur has several courts in the triads, but one location that is mentioned a few times is Cehywig yng Nghernyw, and this is the location of Arthur's court in Culhwch ac Olwen too. There are several other references to Cernyw in early Welsh sources, and if you really study these, it's difficult to tie down the mention of Cernyw to the modern territory of Cornwall. Bard Taliesin sang an awdl in praise of an early Welsh medieval ruler called Cynan Garwin. Cynan was one of the ancestors of the kings of Powys, and Taliesin lists Cernyw as a victim of Cynan's aggression. Ifor Williams, the great scholar, in his edition of Can y Taliesin, he equates Cernyw with the modern territory of Cornwall. But Margaret Haycock, who is a more recent scholar on Taliesin, understands this reference referring to the Cornovi tribe of Shropshire. T.M. Charles Edwards has developed this idea further again. He locates Cernyw to around the old civitas of Viriconium Cornoviorum, Wroxeter. I think that these ideas do make a lot of sense, really. We know that the tribe in the Roman period was called the Cornovi, so it doesn't take a massive stretch of the imagination to imagine that in the early medieval period, the name Cernyw could still have been applied to that area. There are other contenders for the name Cernyw too. Arthurian authors Lloyd and Blake studied the medieval Goganverdd poetry, and according to them, Cernyw makes more sense when applied to Gwynedd. Tantalizingly, they point out that Gehywig exists today as a toponym on the Llŷn Peninsula. Now, I haven't really got time to look any further at Lloyd and Blake's claim in this video, but it's something, once again, that I could come back to another day. Previously, I mentioned that the Welsh triads referred to Cernyw as one of the locations of Arthur's court. This isn't the only time that Cernyw comes up in the triads. One triad, called Tri Gwrthfeichiaid Ynys Prydain, or the Three Powerful Swineherds of Britain, describes Coll ap Coll Vrewi as bringing forth a swine from Penrhyn Awstyn yng Nghernyw. The best suggestion that I've seen as to this location is Oscliffe in Gloucestershire, made by John Rees. And he goes further and suggests that the name Cernyw applies to the whole of the southwest peninsula, so a much greater territory than what we know Cernyw as today. But if we have a close look at Oscliffe, what stands out is that it's really close to the medieval kingdom of Glywysing, which is the modern territory of Glamorgan and Gwent. In fact, it's just over the Severn Bridge, which obviously didn't exist in those days. Okay, so finally, Wilson, Black and Gilbert have suggested that the name Cernyw really refers to the area of southeast Wales, which is where they say King Arthur has his origins and where the Battle of Badon was really fought. Southeast Wales is traditionally understood to have been called Glywysing in the early medieval period, named eponymously after a ruler known as Glywys, who sometimes appears in the Welsh genealogies, interestingly, as Glywys Cernyw. Now, there is often a connection between early medieval figures from southeast Wales and the modern territory of Cornwall. So, does this name Cernyw refer to the territory of Cornwall today, or does it instead connect him to his own territory of southeast Wales? One interesting toponym in southeast Wales is Coed Cernyw, or the Wood of Cernyw. Bradney has suggested that the Cernyw element to this name could derive from Glywys Cernyw, or is the Cernyw element essentially a throwback to when the wider region would have had this name? Glywys, after all, is firmly associated with southeast Wales. There are other place names recorded in the medieval period with the element Cernyw. The Book of Llandaff, which is a fantastic source, lists Llangernyw, and ostensibly, as presented in the Book of Llandaff, this location was part of the old diocese of Llandaff, although it is doubted by many today. Llangernw is believed to be in modern-day Herefordshire, but the early medieval kingdom of Erging, but possibly under the overlordship of the kings of Morgannwg and Gwent or Glywysing in the early medieval period. In the Book of Landa, Llangernw is granted to Saint Dyfrig or Dubricius, and according to some later medieval accounts, Dyfrig was the bishop that crowned Arthur. Just on the Welsh side of the border, historically a toponym, Gellywig, has been recorded in the parish of Llanwyddrin. If you remember, Gellywig and Hernew, that is the place of Arthur's court, according to many very early sources. So there are good reasons to think that Gellywig and Cernyw are in and around South Wales. So where was the Cernyw associated with King Arthur? I've got to be honest, I don't really know. All the suggestions that I've gone through in this video seem really credible to me, and a lot of the information that we have is just fragmentary. A lot has been lost. Let's not forget that Arthur was a figure who's portrayed as fighting battles against Germanic tribes all across Britain and also against other Britons. He could have had courts in any of the places that I've mentioned, or maybe none of them. So my thoughts on whether South East Wales was the Cernyw associated with Arthur. Yes, it could be, but it could be somewhere else as well. What I'd encourage all the listeners to do is just go away and research it for yourself and come up with your own ideas. Then I'm going to wrap up now. So what have we learnt in this video? What I'd like people to go away with is that Badon in Breuddwyd Rhonabwy probably doesn't allude to the location near Llanganwyd, but this doesn't really have any bearing on the actual history of the event. Was Osla Gyllell the leader of the Saxons at Badon? Maybe. And does Cernyw refer to South East Wales in the Arthurian tradition? That is possible too.